The Nintendo DS released on November 21st, 2004, exactly 20 years ago today. To this day, 2 decades later, it's still Nintendo's best-selling console with over 150 million units sold to date. And when you think about it, that number seems pretty reasonable. Everybody and their grandma had a DS back in the day. Quite literally. These things were everywhere. I vividly remember a few instances of finding random kids at the park or at McDonald's who had their DS with them, and I'd play multiplayer with them. With how incredibly successful the DS was, it begs the question of why? Why did the DS sell so well? Was it actually that good? Did it deserve the love it got? Or was it merely the result of a passing fad? Does it stand the test of time and continue to be worth using 20 years later? These are all questions I'm going to answer in this video. This is the Nintendo DS retrospective. The year was 2003. The Game Boy Advance was around its peak at this point, having been on the market for about 2 years. It had some pretty heavy hitter games in its arsenal: Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, Mario Kart Super Circuit, the Mario Advance series, and much more. As great of a handheld as the GBA was, it lacked a certain something. That something being 2 screens. In November 2003, Nintendo announced that a new console would be released. They were very sparing with details at the time, but what they did say is that this new console was not a successor to the Game Boy Advance. Rather, this new console would work alongside the Game Boy Advance, as well as the GameCube. The finalized design for this console was revealed in summer of 2004. This was the original design of the DS. This design might look a little bit foreign to you, and that's because of a redesign that came only a year after launch, but we'll get to that in a second. At this reveal, Hiroshi Yamauchi stated the most badass quote I think I've ever heard out of anybody at Nintendo, being, "If the DS succeeds, we will rise to heaven, but if it fails, we will sink to hell." And rise to heaven they did. Within only about a month after release, the DS had sold over 2 million units, and by summer of the following year, the DS had skyrocketed to a whopping 6.65 million units sold. So yeah, the DS had a pretty good start, to put it lightly. The system had a very simple, albeit kinda ugly design at launch. The most notable thing is the 2 screens. To me, and I'm sure to many other people, this design looks completely normal. I feel that people are very used to this design, but at the time, having 2 screens was pretty foreign. The fact that the console had 2 screens meant developers could be very creative with the games they made for the DS. And what made it especially great for developing games was the fact that the bottom screen acted as a touchscreen. This opened the door to endless possibilities for games. You could use the touchscreen to draw, navigate menus, type, things that would usually be quite a pain to do on a standard controller. Aside from the 2 screens, the layout of the system was quite well made. The system could fold to not only protect the screen and the buttons, but also allow you to slide it into your pocket easily for maximum portability. On the left hand was a D-pad as well as a power button. On the right hand side was A, B, X, Y buttons as well as the start and select buttons. The layout of the buttons is pretty similar to the GBA, but now with the additional X and Y buttons. Something also worth noting is that the DS was the first Nintendo console to have the ability to connect to Wi-Fi, which was a pretty big innovation in and of itself, but especially for a handheld. In addition to being able to connect to Wi-Fi, the DS also supported local play, being able to find other DS systems in your nearby area. You could use this to connect with other people to play games together, and a lot of the time you only needed one person to own the game. Everyone else could simply connect using download play. The original DS model also had a GBA game slot on the bottom, making it fully backwards compatible. Remember how I mentioned that Nintendo stated the DS would not succeed but rather work alongside the GBA? So yeah, that was a complete lie. The full backwards compatibility meant there wasn't much of a reason to use the Game Boy Advance anymore. The DS was overall just a better console than the GBA, and it's not even really a fair comparison. Despite its small size, the DS was a bit of a powerhouse for the time, at least for a handheld. Previously, handheld consoles were pretty underpowered, and were used for more simple games like Pokemon or, I don't know, Tetris. Anytime a major series would make its way to handheld, it would usually have to make a lot of sacrifices, but the DS changed all of that. For the first time, a handheld could compete with the mainline consoles. Some of the games on DS, I'd argue, are better than a lot of console games from the same series, with Mario Kart and New Super Mario Bros. Being some of the most notable examples. And if the original DS design weren't enough for you, in 2006, Nintendo released a variant of the DS called the DS Lite, and 2 years later in 2008, the DSi. These two were far more common than the original DS. Today, I find it still quite common to see the DS Lite and the DSi out in public, but the original DS, I almost never see them in person. The DS Lite was probably the most common version of the DS. It's the one that I and most people had. This version had a more symmetrical and sleek design than the original, making the body much slimmer and easier to hold. The DS Lite also moved some buttons around. The power button was now on the right side of the console, and the start and select buttons were relocated to the bottom right. The stylus had also moved from the back of the console to the right hand side, somewhere your hand more naturally rests. The DSi was far more of a jump. While it looks relatively similar to the DS Lite, it looked completely different upon turning the console console on. The DSi had released shortly after the Wii, so Nintendo tried matching the style of the Wii, giving the DSi a home menu with the same aesthetic as the Wii. The DSi also came with a camera that allowed for some pretty mediocre photos, but this was pretty cool back in the day. You could edit your photos, and I had lots of fun with this as a kid. There was of course the famous flip notes, which allowed for animation, using the bottom screen for drawing. This is a pretty creative and smart utilization of the touchscreen. All these additions from the DSi are great, but don't think the DS and DS Lite didn't have some cool features installed too. The most famous would be PictoChat. PictoChat allowed for you to connect to other DSs in the area and send messages to each other, using the touchscreen to draw images and messages that could be sent to each other. Then, of course, was Download Play. With how small game files were on the DS, usually being smaller than a gigabyte, games could be downloaded pretty quickly. Download Play allowed for you to connect to someone else's game, temporarily downloading the game onto your device so you could play multiplayer together. This meant that if you had a group of friends who wanted to play Mario Party DS, only one person needed to own the game, and the other 3 players could temporarily download the game via Download Play to join in. If you ever plan on buying a DS today, the DS Lite is probably the version I'd recommend. It takes any issues people may have had with the original DS, primarily being kind of ugly, and fixes them while maintaining all the original features. While I love the DSi, it does lack a Game Boy Advance port, meaning it's not fully backwards compatible. If you don't care about the Game Boy Advance games, then maybe just go for the DSi. As much as I love things like PictoChat, the reason that I and everyone else got a DS was for the games. Unless you bought the DS just for PictoChat, I don't know. The DS had an incredible catalog of games. Firstly, I want to talk about more heavy hitter games that were on the DS. Starting right off at launch, the DS already had a pretty decent catalog of games, the most notable being Mario 64 DS. Terrible title aside, this was groundbreaking for the time. For the first time ever, you could play Mario 64, a pretty revolutionary title on its own, on a handheld. This game runs pretty well too, and in many instances looks better than the original. Great as it was back then, playing it recently, the DS wasn't really designed to play a 3D open world game like this, having only a D-pad and no control stick like on the N64. The controls just aren't great, but the mere fact that this was on the DS at launch goes to show how impressive DS was for the time. Plus, if you didn't want to deal with the somewhat meh controls of Mario 64 DS, the game also came with a collection of mini-games. Some of these games are pretty addictive and quite fun, usually utilizing the touchscreen and stylus, taking full advantage of the hardware. The game also introduced gambling into the Mario series. So there's that. As a kid, I was too stupid to understand how any of the gambling games worked, but I'm willing to bet there's at least one person out there with a gambling addiction that leads back to this game. These minigames were also accessible on another DS game, New Super Mario Bros., which released 2 years later. Now this was the reason people were buying the Nintendo DS. The New Super Mario Bros. Series is pretty overdone now, but at the time, this was fresh. We hadn't seen a mainline 2D Mario game in years, so this was a great revival of the formula. And the game was good too. To this day, I'd argue this is the best of the New Super Mario Bros. Series. On the topic of being some of the best games in their respective series, Mario Kart DS. Everyone's got their favorite Mario Kart, and usually it's pretty biased and subjective opinion, but I don't think there's anybody out there who dislikes Mario Kart DS. The game is especially impressive when you compare it to the previous portable Mario Kart game being Super Circuit for the Game Boy Advance. Super Circuit was by no means a bad game, but you can see the drastic improvement not only in graphics, but in gameplay. Mario Kart DS could actually compete with the main console Mario Kart games, whereas Super Circuit, I mean, it was cool to play Mario Kart on the go, but this was never going to be your go-to Mario Kart game, you know? The Mario series did pretty great on the DS, but the series that truly peaked in this era was Pokemon. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl was a massive jump for the Pokemon series. It was these games that introduced so much to the series, especially in regards to gameplay. The bottom screen was used a lot in this game, primarily for battles. The graphics had a massive jump in this generation. When you look at the previous Game Boy Advance games, they were far more similar to the original games, with very bare-bone graphics. This was the first time the Pokemon series looked good. Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, remakes of Gold and Silver, are widely considered to be the best games in the Pokemon series. They had probably the most content out of any Pokemon game, having an entire post-game taking place in the Kanto region. Pokemon Black and White took what Diamond and Pearl did to the series and improved on it. The bottom screen was now perfectly utilized, adding so many ease of access things to the series. The graphics managed to take a pretty big leap too. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl took advantage of the hardware it was on, but Black and White pushed it to its limits. It was the games after Black and White the Pokemon series began to go downhill with X and Y. While these games are all great and sold incredibly well, it was more of the casual games that really boosted the popularity of the DS. Previously, video games were more so directed at kids, or at the very least not so much for the entire family. The DS was one of the first steps in changing that, releasing games that just about anybody could enjoy. The most popular of which is likely Nintendogs. Now, I never had Nintendogs. I had 3 actual dogs myself, but this game allowed for kids who didn't live in a zoo, like me, to live without their dog having dreams. Nintendogs took full advantage of the DS's hardware, primarily using the touchscreen throughout the game. The built-in microphone was also used at many points, a feature of the DS that I feel like most people forget about. Brain Age. This was the game that really pulled in people's grandmothers to the DS. Brain Age was designed to help keep your brain sharp by giving you puzzles and math equations that could be solved using the touchscreen and stylus. The point of the game is that you'd only play a little bit every day, sort of as a quick workout for your head. I suppose this is perfect for old people who were scared of losing their minds. I'm surprised Nintendo hasn't made an official Brain Age app for mobile devices, since the game you only use a little bit every day would work perfectly on modern phones. Mario Party DS. Now this might be considered more of a heavy hitter game, but I had to count it as a casual game since, at its core, Mario Party is designed to be played with friends and family. While this definitely isn't the best Mario Party in the series, I'd argue it's at least in the top half. Mario Party DS takes full advantage of the DS hardware with mini-games, and the theming here is also quite unique. Mario and the gang get shrunken down to ant size by Bowser, and each of the mini-games revolve around this. This game probably has the best use of download play. A lot of games that use download play would give the visitor player some sort of limitation as incentive for them to go out and buy the full game, to get the full experience. With Mario Party DS, they had none of that. Since the whole point of Mario Party is multiplayer, using download play let you play Mario Party as normal. Finally, I want to discuss the final category of DS games, shovelware. Now, what's considered shovelware might vary from person to person, but in short, these were games that usually were made pretty quickly and cheaply just for the sake of having the game out there. The Wii was notorious for having a lot of shovelware, but the DS certainly had its fair share. Some examples include Garfield's Fun Fest, The Rub Rabbits, Bratz Ponies, Imagine Babies, and possibly the most infamous of them all, M&M Kart Racing. Now, in fairness, some of these shovelwares were actually pretty good. I consider a lot of shovelware games to be some of my favorites, although at that point, you might not even consider them shovelware games. Maybe they're just third-party games. One thing you'll notice about almost every DS game is that they take pretty good advantage of the hardware, whether it be utilizing the two screens for gameplay or cutscenes, using the touchscreen in a multitude of ways, or even using the built-in microphone. The DS was like a Swiss Army knife for game development, allowing for so many options. A lot of things the DS introduced are now pretty common, or at the very least have been used in gaming since. Firstly, obviously, was the 3DS. The 3DS basically just took everything the DS did and expanded upon it. The 3DS had better graphics and could run more advanced games, allowing for mobile gaming quite easily, utilizing touchscreen and dual screen and so on. Aside from Nintendo though, plenty of modern mobile gaming trends were shaped from the DS. It wasn't too long after the DS that mobile gaming became big, with releases like Angry Birds, Cut the Rope, Flappy Bird, and so on, only coming a few years down the road. Most major mobile games are designed to be used with touch controls, something that the DS kinda introduced. Not only that, but I believe the DS does a better job with touch controls than most phone games. The fact that the DS uses a stylus rather than your hands means you can be a lot more precise, and I always preferred the feel of the stylus against the DS screen as opposed to fingers against a phone screen. The DS had a big impact not just handheld gaming, but even mobile phone gaming. But how does the DS stack up against the other handheld consoles at the time? The main competitor of the DS was the PSP. Now, I owned a PSP as a kid as well, and while I did love it, it's clear the PSP didn't really have a catalog designed to be portable. The PSP was essentially just a way of playing PS2 games on the go, which is cool, don't get me wrong. But the small size and kind of crappy joystick meant it was always just a less favorable way of playing your favorite games, and you were usually just better off playing the PS2 versions. The DS, on the other hand, went the opposite route. While yes, there were many mainline games you could now play on the go, the DS didn't try and port console games over to its hardware. Rather, they developed new games to fit with their hardware and optimize these games to work well with what you had. Yeah, you could cram the Wally game into your PSP and it'll play, but wouldn't you rather just play the game on your PS2? Okay, maybe the Wally game's not a good example. This is not to say that the PSP was bad. The console was definitely a lot more powerful and technically capable than the DS, but that's not what the DS was trying to accomplish. And I'm glad that Nintendo went the creative route they did. And I feel like going down that route also sparked something pretty big in Nintendo. Since the DS, Nintendo's been constantly taking pretty big leaps with their game consoles. Just shortly after the DS was the Wii, being incredibly unique with its hardware being revolved around motion controls. The Wii U, while being a bit of a flop, introduced the ability to play your home consoles on either your TV or the gamepad, which then led to the Switch furthering this idea and allowing you to play either on the go or at home. Nintendo never really participates in the console wars anymore. It's PlayStation and Xbox duking it out, and then there's Nintendo on the side doing their own thing. But they're succeeding at it, and it was the DS that began all of this. Like Hiroshi Yamauchi said, if the DS succeeds, we will rise to heaven, but if it fails, we will sink to hell. The DS is what really sent Nintendo into heaven, or whatever. So do I think the DS is as good as we remember? Absolutely, and possibly even better. The DS not only revolutionized the portable gaming industry, but fully changed the trajectory of Nintendo as a whole. For the first time, portable gaming wasn't just a means of playing your console games on the go, at the sacrifice of poor quality. Now you could play games you might have actually preferred over your main console games. The DS put out some of the best games in their respective series. I still find myself going back to titles like Mario Kart DS, even though there are newer titles at my disposal. It makes sense that so many people had this thing, and sitting at such a low price point of only $150 US, why would you not want it? The DS will always hold an incredibly special place in my heart. While I have loved the newer consoles since then, with the 3DS being a ton of fun, the Switch having some crazy good games, the original DS is just something they can never be. I often find myself wishing that something would come along and do what the DS did, so that I could experience it all over again. But that's part of what makes the DS so special, the fact that nothing else can be it.
Bye-bye!
You know my opinion. What about you? Let me know your thoughts and experiences in the DS below.